if Biden doesn't follow through on this promise and the student debt crisis continues to grow as it does, what do we do next? And is some kind of debt strike on the table?
So I don't think I totally followed my thought about the creditor's constitution through. So I want people to join the Debt Collective because we need to be the founding fathers' worst nightmares. So one thing, it wasn't just that Thomas Jefferson, as you said, had some enlightened ideas about debt. He thought that for white men like himself, that debt should extinguish after a reasonable amount of time, a generation, which he thought was about 19 years. But he recognized that debt could be used as a tool of social control and racial domination. So he actually recommended driving indigenous communities into debt, forcing them to give up their lands as a way of dispossessing them. If you read Madison's Federalist Papers, he talks about the wicked project of debt abolition. And this is because there were debtors' revolts in the colonial era, so Shays Rebellion, but basically debtors were the working class, right? And what they were fighting for was the right to have their debt canceled and to regain some economic equality and mobility. And John Adams wrote after the Constitution, was set, that he defended the version they enacted against a more democratic one, because if it had been more democratic, then people would have wanted debt abolition. And then, what would happen next? They'd be raising taxes on the wealthy, and they'd be redistributing property, right? I mean, geez. So, this is not, even though we often historicize things and say, okay, wow, personal debt's exploded since the 1970s. And, student debt in particular was not even measured seriously in a disciplined way until the late 90s. That's how recent a problem this is. We have to have that longer perspective that, again, this is really about power, and this is about democracy. Who's making decisions about, who's entitled to what and what we deserve and what we have to pay for the things we need to survive. Again, going back to those founders, creditors have been organized. They've been advocating for themselves, writing the Constitution, writing the laws that govern us, repealing protections for borrowers with the help of politicians like Joe Biden, rolling back usury limits. So in the 80s, there was a big Supreme Court case that said, hey, let's have no holds barred on that, charge interest out the wazoo. The problem is that throughout throughout the exception of these limited revolts, debtors have not been organized. We haven't been organized into a political formation where we could wield power and have influence and have a seat at the table. So what would have happened in 2008 if mortgage holders had been organized, right, when the banking sector collapsed? Because there was actually tons of money there to write down the principles of these underwater mortgages. Obama and Joe Biden, his vice president, could have spent millions and millions and millions and millions and more. And they were actually supposed to help millions more homeowners than they did with principal reductions. They didn't. But there also wasn't a sort of force of debtors, saying, hey, listen to us too. So, we have a power problem here. And so I don't expect Joe Biden to keep any promise out of the goodness of his heart. We have to build the power to make him do that. And power comes in many forms. It's political, it's like electoral power. It's getting people who actually will stand up for this issue. And, we have advocates now in Washington. When Debt Collective was founded and we were demanding jubilees, 10 years ago, there was nobody in Washington saying cancel rent, cancel medical debt, cancel student debt. I mean, that didn't exist. So we need to keep going on that front. But you also need that disruptive power, that economic power. And so absolutely, we are only where we are. The only reason that we're having a conversation right now, me and you, about student debt cancellation is because the Debt Collective organized the first ever student debt strike in 2015. That economic disobedience is what got people's attention, what scared the hell out of the Department of Education and the Obama administration. And, 100%, debt strikes have to be done strategically. You have to, an individual default is not a strike, right? Just, like with any labor strike.
How does that work, though? Like, what does that look like to organize? Either you mentioned earlier, mortgage debtors. What does it look like to organize student loan debtors in a way that makes it seem like it's not just individuals hanging out on a limb, that there is a body of people? Like what would it take? Is it getting enough people to commit on a signature form? Is it getting enough people to represent their volume in person at marches and rallies? Like what would it take to present that kind of a threat in a way that is credible?
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. We need to be a credible threat. Because that is, it's wonderful. I think this is one lesson from the 2020 primary, right? It's great to have plans, but what we need is power, right? We need the power behind those plans. And so, organizing debtors is a lot like any other kind of organizing, right? So just, you have to get people who have a common condition to identify with each other, and to agree, on strategies and to take action. So, we've done this in multiple ways. So when over the course of our for-profit college campaign, we did everything from disrupting official government sessions, right? Where, sort of like at the Department of Education and beyond, we lobbied. Again, we had a debt strike where people refused to pay the debts that they knew to be totally unjust and illegitimate. We also had a legal strategy. So using borrower defense was a legal strategy, but we didn't depend on the law alone, right? We politicized it. We also refused to engage a legal strategy in a kind of individualized way, like, oh, you just submit your dispute, you submit your claim. We collectivized everything, right? So people were always working as a mass under the, with the awareness that there's power in numbers. We also engaged in disruptive protests. So we disrupted a lending industry gathering. This year, it's quite interesting now, though, because there is a payment pause for federal student loans, right? So a student debt strike in that way doesn't mean anything on a material basis. If anything, we've seen that they don't freaking need our money, right? Nobody's making their payments.
So that's the question. If he turns the spigot back on, like this is the question. If when this all the postponement expires in September? What would happen? And should it be the case that the plan is to just not pay?
Yeah. So I want to say one thing I think is really critical. Why it was reported in Politico this week that the White House is incredibly eager to turn on student loan payments, not because it thinks that people are ready to make them, not because it thinks there's actually been such an improvement in people's material lives, but because they do not like the optics. This is what White House advisors told the reporter. They do not like the optics of continuing a pandemic relief program into 2022 when they're supposed to have had an economic recovery. In other words, continuing to provide relief undermines their message that everything's normal and everything's great now, right? So that's what we're up against. We're up against
so ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. We're up against a White House that also has the solution staring them in the face. In other words, they have an alternative they don't need to turn on the payments. They can cancel student debt using compromise and settlement authority, right? The Department of Education literally requires a signature and your federal student loans are gone. And the Debt Collective actually wrote the executive order for Joe Biden. I do not recommend that people refuse payment unless they're organized. So if people want to strategize about what to do next, I absolutely invite them to join the Debt Collective, not just if you have student debt, but we will also be protesting. I do want to say that we are going to be holding a protest in Washington, D.C. in September, and it's not too late for people to be part of the planning of that. The thing is that the left we're coming out of decades of the left being disorganized and demobilized. And so I'm always just, very conscious of the fact that the thing we need to do more than anything else is come together and begin to strategize and begin to develop discipline.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, I want to talk about if I can just dig down on that, because one might argue that absolutely people should join the Debt Collective. And I want you to talk about what that means to be, what does it mean to have a debtors union? Yeah. But, let's say hypothetically if the Debt Collective, and I'm not trying to write your organization's agenda for you, but one might see an opportunity in saying, okay, the thing that we're going to do to apply pressure on Joe Biden, at very least not to end the student debt abatement, and to provide an additional incentive for him just to cancel it all. I mean, one way not to have the program continue into a post-pandemic world, in quotation, post-pandemic world, is to just cancel the whole thing. But to say, join the Debt Collective, and we are all collectively going to do a debt strike if student debt payments are turned back on again.
So because we have done, so we did the debt strike in 2015 with the students who went to Corinthian colleges, and that grew. And then we actually did a debt strike right before the pandemic where we launched a campaign. And so I think a debt strike is one of the tools. So a debt strike is absolutely 100% on the table. It just is one of the various forms of power we're trying to build, right? And that's why it has to be coupled with, I think, because debtors are, one thing is that they're geographically dispersed. So when a labor organization, when a labor union goes on strike, you're in the workplace, maybe you even do a sit down strike and you all sit down and you refuse to leave your place of work. Debtors are geographically dispersed. So there's always the challenge of like making our presence known. But yes, that's absolutely on the table. It also could, the other thing is we don't just organize around student debt. So perhaps what's needed is other forms of solidarity with student debtors. So you mentioned this, you said something about, well, what if we mapped out who has student debt and who has medical debt? A lot of times it's the same people. Student debtors have all these other forms. So it might also be that what we need to do in the months ahead is actually broaden our analysis to show how all of these forms of indebtedness are connected. Because there's lots of different targets. When you're targeting student debt, our target's the Department of Education, which is a uniquely powerful lender because they're backed by the public purse, by the United States. So, what we've seen this year is they don't need our money, right? They don't need the payments of student debtors. Everything is going fine with these payment pauses, right? There are other targets that debtors might organize against where that's not the case. Right. So, a hospital that they're indebted to, or a payday lender or a bank. Right. So there's different strategies depending on what the target is. But it might be that what we need is to broaden out and have a more holistic view of all the various forms of debts and how they compound and intersect. But absolutely, I think economic disobedience, which is the phrase we use, and debt strikes need to be on the table. And that, that's one of the lessons from the labor movement is if you're not willing to escalate, right, then you're not going to be able to win the things that you're demanding.
But what happened in 2015 to the people who did not pay their debt, who went on strike?
They've gotten their debts canceled. Right. Absolutely.
What was that process? Was there, what kind of back and forth was there about it? Was there any fear or risk at any time that there would just be
absolutely
thrown into default and incur all kinds of consequences for their credit score or what have you?
Yeah. So in fact, I vividly remember being with with some of the early student debt strikers in 2015, and the governor of Florida, whose name I'm forgetting right now. Anyway, he went on Fox News and he said,
Ron DeSantis. He was still there.
I'm pretty sure it was Ron DeSantis. I can't. But anyway, he went on Fox News and he said to the people who are going on debt strike, I want to tell you, not to do this, and also you'll be punished. You'll lose your driver's license. And so this is something a lot of people don't realize is that when you default on your student loans in some states, you can lose your license. Like for example, let's say you're a teacher or you're a barber, you'll lose your license, but you can also lose your driver's license. So there are these really punitive measures. And it was a moment of real fear, right? It's not a fun feeling to be threatened by a governor on, a hostile news network.
Sure.
But this was a case where people were suffering. They were already suffering the worst consequences, right? They were being crushed by huge debts from these schools. They were reaping no benefits. They were unemployed, or they couldn't be employed in their field. And we did a lot of work. So just, and this is the same thing. If you're organizing a labor strike at a place of employment, you do a lot of work before you strike. Sometimes you organize for years, right? Getting people ready. So we had done that work. People decided to stick with it. And we, went on an absolutely aggressive campaign against the Obama Department of Education, basically saying that they were propping up these criminal schools. They were actually bailing them out, just as they bailed out the banks. They were bailing out these predatory schools. They were preventing students from getting debt discharges that they were entitled to through other means. Of course, eventually some of the Obama era officials went to work for these institutions. They went to work for Apollo Group, which owns University of Phoenix. So there was a revolving door. Wow. But basically, they refused payment. We enacted this. We made these claims, again, borrow defense. And through about 2 years of just constant pressuring and organizing, um, forced them to acknowledge there are arguments were right, and they issued relief not just for the original people who went on debt strike and then the hundreds who joined, but now the Biden administration, after a pause under Trump, is now issuing debt cancellation using the same arguments. So it was not immediate, and I think this is the lesson of organizing. And it was not something that anyone could have done on their own, because people could have made the same sort of legal claims and made the same arguments as individuals, and they never would have gotten anywhere. It absolutely took collective action and an insistence on doing things together to not be sort of picked off one by one in order to get where we are. So there's certainly a lesson for student debtors who want to organize today. And again, the mechanism is clear. All it will take is Joe Biden saying, Secretary Cardona, use your compromise and settlement authority to cancel student debt.
Astra, is there like a magic number? Like if people listen to this and it went super viral and you had, 15 million people sign up for the Debt Collective tomorrow, would that make you feel more inclined to say, oh yeah, we're doing a debt strike?
I think the student debt stuff is interesting. I think I'm still processing what it means to have had this massive payment pause, right? Because it's just proof we don't actually have economic leverage over the Department of Education. So debtors could have economic leverage over other targets, right? Like over a hospital, over a payday lender. Ultimately, you could have leverage over Wells Fargo, over bank, student debt is a tricky one, right? Because also the person who has the authority is the president. Mm-hmm. And so I'm also like, what is he afraid of? Like what threat can debtors wield against him? Like, in other words, the risk of not keeping power in the midterms, or, Democrats not winning. So I think it's actually a challenge. What is the, because we're so in like this political game right now with it.
Yeah. I mean, isn't the flip side of, you can't, the Department of Education doesn't really need your money, that it's ridiculous to ask a bunch of people to pay them. You know what I mean? Like, I understand that you can't kind of like hold their feet to the fire the way you can an institution that actually needs those proceeds. But the flip side of that is, okay, then why are you putting us through the ringer? And then what are the politics of Joe Biden co-signing them, putting us through the ringer in the middle of this crisis?
Yeah. The reason I'm thinking about this is we've tried this multiple times before. There was one time with the Occupy Student Debt campaign where it was pretty ingenious. It was actually, I wasn't involved in this, but the idea was having people sign up. And then when it got to a critical mass, like, in other words, if 500,000 people commit, if 500,000 people sign this, then we'll all go on debt strikes, to know that there's that kind of collectivity. Mm-hmm. And it might have been that it was a good idea at the right time. So we've always had that, like, maybe we'll do that in the future. In other words, maybe 2012 was just too soon, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we're in a different moment now. Mm-hmm. So, and if you're speaking to Thomas Gokey, who is my co-founder, he would be like, absolutely, he would basically be like, what you're saying is absolutely what I want. We just need the student debt strike to have its moment and go viral and have enough people. Mm-hmm. And it could be that that's what would tip the scales. I mean, it would be huge. I mean, I could fucking make hay out of that if it happened. So I would be happy. I'm always like, what other threats, right? Like, what, especially now with them, with basically knowing like they literally need to collect no money and they're just churning along. But, that was the dream that motivated us for a long time, was like, surely there'll be a kind of tipping point. And it literally on February 7th, 2020, we launched a student debt strike of like 2,500 people. And we called it off because of the pandemic a month later. Like, it was just, it was just like the wrong moment. Right.
I mean, it does feel, and, obviously you have all the insight into this and I have none, but it does feel like we're in a moment. Like, I keep saying this over and over again. You can't go to the comment section of any pop culture website without seeing a bunch of people screaming about how I didn't get my stimmy and I was told that my student debt was going to get canceled. Yeah. Like, people are pissed off.
Right. And as they should be.
Right. And it feels like the hiatus, it only makes it that much more deep, because we're all at the same time conscious of our student debt all in one moment. If the spigot gets turned back down,
right? Like, I think that will be the moment. And so our plan is this protest in September, and then organizing even more intensely with the people who are sort of galvanized by that. And so civil disobedience of debtors, right? Like this is not, it won't just be a parade. If there was mass appetite for debt strike, we would still be on board. The other thing the Debt Collective has always said and always done is that one thing we try to do is reframe non-payment. So a lot of people are on strike privately, right? They're in non-payment. They're suffering from the consequences of default. And one thing we want to do is like politicize those people and bring them out of the shadows. 1 million people default every year. That's 1 million debt strikers, only they're doing it like all alone and all ashamed, you know? Right. So I think calling people out of the woodwork who are actually already in a state of non-payment and then being like, okay, this is where we're starting from. Who wants to join?
Do you have?
Yeah.
Sorry, good.
No. And just saying like, if you fucking turn the payments on, a lot of people are really fucking terrified of that. So I think that is a moment that will be that is a moment we're working towards.
So for listeners who do want to be a part of that effort and who would, potentially want to join the Debt Collective, how could they do that? Yeah.
So www.debtcollective.org, and then come to one of our onboarding meetings. And we organize geographically. So there are branches around the country, and then we organize by debt type. So, these are the targets, again, because debtors don't share a workplace. So we organize by by debt type and by target, and also by building power in the community and hoping to sort of change laws at the local and state level and improve protection. So those are the kind of strategic mechanisms we're using. There is power in numbers, as I said. And I will maybe end with our slogan, which I think just rings really true, which is "You are not alone." Space LOAN, which is, you're more than your debt, but also, a lot of people are in the same boat, and it's way better to fight together than to drown all alone.
Hey, YouTube, don't forget this is a podcast. To get full episodes, including ones that are behind a paywall, go to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. To get more episodes, please do subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and like this video.